Welcome to Supercool, the show about real-world climate solutions that cut carbon, improve profitability, and enhance modern life. Each week on Supercool, we go behind the headlines to pinpoint the stories and data accelerating the low-carbon economy in towns and cities across the U.S. and around the globe. I'm your host, Josh Dorfman. Stay up to date on Supercool by subscribing or following us wherever you're listening, and please leave us a review. Listeners of the show know that we spend a lot of time speaking with innovators operating at the intersection of business, technology, and climate. The range of solutions and the pace at which they're scaling marks, in our view, a new era in the race to decarbonize our economy. We've seen AI giving buildings brains with BrainBox AI. We've seen trash getting hauled away below city streets in pneumatic tubes with NVAC. We've seen school buses electrified and bus routes optimized so kids get to school on time and less stressed out with Zoom. Amidst so much exciting disruption, we wanted to step back and gather some additional perspective to make sense of this moment as the low-carbon economy accelerates. So today, my guest is someone many of you will know from her years of technology and business reporting for national media outlets including Wired, CNET, The New York Times, and NPR's Marketplace. In fact, if you close your eyes and just listen to her voice, which I did the first time we spoke because I'm a geeky superfan of hers and of the show Marketplace, you will recognize the distinctive and insightful voice of Molly Wood. In early 2022, after nearly 7 years at Marketplace working alongside legendary host Kai Ryssdal and running the Marketplace Tech Report amongst her many projects, Molly left a dazzling journalism career to become a climate tech investor. How she came to that decision is a story in its own right, which we'll hear about. What's particularly interesting for today's show is Molly's perspective on how she sees the clean energy transition unfolding, the technologies and approaches that are working, the layers of innovation needed to further accelerate growth, and where all of this future is heading. And she has quite a lot to say on the subjects because 2 years ago, she jumped back into journalism and reporting, this time with a focus on climate tech through her podcast and newsletter, Everybody in the Pool, which we'll also hear more about today. Here's my conversation with Molly. Molly, welcome to Supercool.
Thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
So I feel like the place to start is I was listening to your exit interview from Marketplace and Marketplace Tech. So going back a few years ago, as you'd spent this career as a tech journalist, business reporter, in all of the places that probably everyone's very envious and aspires to be. And you said a few things that I'm going to talk about in that exit interview. But as I was probing further into your work with Marketplace and came across the source code, which I actually didn't know that you had done this podcast. So in the source code where you go in and you interview all these people and then a clip of that or some minutes of that make it on the Marketplace. But your first episode or your first interview was with William Gibson. And that just struck me as very appropriate for this conversation because he, of course, is attributed with the quote, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." We think about that from a super cool perspective. I'm sure you think about that from the perspective of the platform you're building. So maybe let's just jump in there.
That's funny. I think somewhere on my Instagram is the screenshot of the calendar invitation that says William Gibson on it. And the caption is me being like, I am without words because this is the best day of my life, which it was. And you kind of have rightly put your finger on probably one of the biggest influences in my life and thinking and coverage, which is sci-fi. And in fact, even when I was making the turn from the tech and business coverage that I had done for 20 plus years into climate tech, that turn was happening at a moment when I was reading a bunch of sci-fi about mostly apocalypses and, you know, the end of the world. I think I was reading like Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson and something else. And it was just a mess. And then I started reading Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140 The one that takes place in New York, and it's after 2 sequential 50-foot sea level rises have inundated New York City. But this book is really the prototype for Ministry of the Future. It's about climate change and global markets and capitalism. And so it's because it's New York, everyone's still living there and like doing capitalism and all of that. So I'm reading this book, and there's this kind of throwaway reference in the book to the fact that they have put this diamond coating around the bottoms of these buildings to keep the water out. Like the buildings are submerged, but there's this diamond coating around the bottoms, and it keeps the water out so people can still live in them. And I thought, I wonder who's working on that. Like somebody must be, in my tech reporter brain, I was like, does that exist? Is there a lab somewhere where somebody's working on the diamond coating? Like and it led to this kind of question about adaptation and exploration. And then that coincided with, I happened to share a hairdresser with a world famous climate scientist. And so we were getting our hair cut at the same time. And she was talking about turning a lot of her attention to 100-year out problems because so much warming was really baked in. And she said, okay, at this point, it is an engineering problem. And those are the words that like made it a tech story for me. So as with so many things, it was an external influence of somebody saying an interesting thing, which from journalism is like, that's the holy grail, but also sci-fi, like the idea of imagining a different future. And I've just been a lifelong sci-fi reader. And so I think like the William Gibson thing is the perfect place to start because that's kind of always where my brain goes.
Wow, that's awesome. As I hear sometimes in the podcast, where you're like, oh, I could take this in a million different ways. I could take this in a million different ways. But to stay on this track of transitioning away from marketplace and then transitioning to becoming an investor, looking at climate tech. So I mentioned your exit interview on Marketplace Tech where you were being interviewed. And the question was, what are some of the things that really excite you? And so this was 3 years ago, I guess, November 2021. And you had talked about fusion. Right? Mm-hmm. Fusion energy, nuclear fusion. And that was very interesting to me. Before I went and launched Planted, so also in 2021, I'd been talking to Commonwealth Fusion about coming in to help their like innovation track and some of the things they wanted to do with the government. And so I was very focused on that too. I thought it was really interesting. And then you interviewed Bob Mumgard just a few months ago. Maybe let's just start with nuclear fusion. I mean, we haven't talked about it on this show yet, and that's just a fascinating topic. And so the broader question is, like, what moment are we in? Because that's just such a game changer on a magnitude really different than kind of everything else that anyone's even working on.
Yeah, it really is. We're like starting at the end goal in some ways. If we go straight to fusion. Bob's going to tell you, by the way, that they only call it fusion energy. They're like trying not to say the N word.
I noticed that.
Yes, because the adoption question hinges on whether you can get people to want fusion energy power plants in their neighborhoods. Back to sci-fi.
Yeah.
Every kind of utopian sci-fi universe, every sci-fi story that takes place in space or in which there are multiplanetary species assumes that fusion has been solved. Like fusion is the game changer. There was an article several years ago. It was this really brief Bloomberg piece, and it was so beautiful because it was basically like, let's imagine what a world looks like with unlimited, carbon-free, inexpensive, virtually free energy. What can you solve for? You solve desalination. Any big energy intensive project, like California doesn't have any water, but it's next to an ocean. But desalination requires a lot of energy, and that's greenhouse gas producing, or it's really expensive. And then you got to figure out what to do with the salt. If energy is no longer an issue, that problem is 100% solved. If hydrogen production, right now, green hydrogen production is too energy intensive to be economically viable, fusion solves that problem. So then all of a sudden, heavy industry, air travel, even transportation solved. And that's just like leaving aside powering everything. And right now we live in this like Jevons paradox where the more technology we have, the more we want to use. See also like data centers and AI. You don't have to worry about powering data centers and AI if you have fusion. So it's the end goal and the foundation of everything that we could accomplish as we look toward a truly better world. Carbon capture, all of it. I could go on and on and on. So then the question really is just like, where are we in terms of the science and the deployment? And the science, most of the fusion companies will tell you, the science is mostly solved. Like they're getting there in different ways, and there are kind of new technologies that are enabling things like these like really high temperature magnetic strips and blah, blah, blah. It's just the economics and the deployment and the adoption. And those things are really hard. So like, where are we? We're basically at like Nokia brick phone. If I think about like, if I put climate tech on a parallel track to the technology that I grew up covering, you know, from 1999 on, we were at like pagers. And then we got that little Nokia brick phone that everybody had. And then that turned into the Motorola StarTech. And then that turned into the BlackBerry. And the BlackBerry turned into the Trio. And that turned into the iPhone. And then all of a sudden we had always on internet and broadband and these apps that take us anywhere in virtual reality, right? But we're at pager to maybe Nokia brick phone with some of these technologies.
Yeah, I have to digest that only because since fusion is just, as you've described it, this almost impossible to imagine holy grail of energy. It is really hard to imagine that we would even be at the pager base because no one's going to see anything. Like there can be these industry conversations, but it's like, okay, now it's 2034, it's 2035. Is it here? And it's suddenly like when it's here, I mean, I get what you're saying in terms of like
that's true.
Just
maybe we're at like the invention of telecommunications. So, we're at telecommunications, but, and it hasn't translated into a device yet. That could be.
But it is an awesome kind of thought exercise, and I think it is a really interesting launch point for this conversation because, yeah, solve climate change, sure. But how about also no more wars for energy in the Middle East and elsewhere, right? You have to start wondering, well, what the hell are we going to be killing each other for if it's not energy, you know, because I'm sure we'll figure out something. But
we'll find a way.
Just to think about that then and say, okay, well, leaving nuclear fusion aside, and I did find that interview awesome, and I did really key in when Bob Mumgard did say, we're not saying nuclear fusion, one, because it's just confusing and people have a reaction to nuclear.
Right.
The MRI example, like MRI is nuclear technology, but we don't say nuclear, hey, go get in the nuclear health
nuclear
machine.
imaging resonance machine. Yeah. Everybody's like, no, thank you, I'm out.
Yeah,
right.
We'll just call it an MRI and everyone will get it. So I really love that because I do think just the framing of how we talk about some of these technologies, of how companies talk about them to actually like gain adoption is increasingly of paramount importance. In terms of energy transformation today, energy transition, clean energy transition, how would you assess this moment of, again, of like, I don't know if we want to use the telecom example, but what are you seeing now that you have everybody in the pool, you're doing investing, you're advising lots of companies, you're in the Bay Area. What do you see that excites you? What do you see that's particularly innovative? Who's doing a great job? Just curious how you see this moment.
I mean, this moment is sort of extra loaded. There's what this moment might have looked like 6 months ago when we had the IRA and we felt confident about that. And it seemed like a foregone conclusion that the world was headed in one direction. And now this moment is a little bit layered. I still think that business and the world are headed in the direction of renewable energy and decarbonization, if only for reasons of economics and risk assessment. Like, we know that renewable electrons are the cheapest electrons on the planet. And also, climate change doesn't care if you believe in climate change. It's still coming. It's still going to happen. And insurers and reinsurers are saying entire portions of the planet are no longer insurable. And so if you're Verizon and you want to situate some infrastructure and spend some CapEx and build a new whatever, and you can't get insurance for that thing because of climate risk, then all of a sudden your calculations as a business change. I remain convinced that we're headed in this direction. It's just that progress is not a straight line. And then to the question of what is interesting, this is sort of meta. This is not necessarily related to any specific technology. I mean, I think there's like a lot that's interesting that's happening in that space. I will never stop being obsessed with batteries.
Yeah.
I just think that's like such an unlock technology that I love how these things develop over time. People are like, oh yeah, solar is great, except for this one thing, which is like sometimes the sun is not out. And then you sort of realize like, oh, as you deploy, oh, okay, we have solar and that really works. And it's the energy from the sun and you can get it anywhere for the most part, but you kind of have to store it and distribute it because there's this system for energy distribution. And what if there was a way to, batteries. And then it's this, we think that it all happens all at the same time, right? But it's like one thing at a time. Like I'm old enough to remember when the self-driving car people realized that snow was going to be an issue for them. Like literally they were just testing self-driving cars in California. And then they took a bunch of them to Detroit and realized that when it snows, the cars can't see. It's just these like realizations all along the road. So love batteries, love battery innovation. What I think is really interesting about energy is the idea of decentralized energy. This trend I'm starting to call bring your own power, where if I am at my house and I have solar and a battery, and then I have another battery in the form of an EV sitting in my driveway that hopefully is going to get bidirectional charging soon, where it can give back to the grid, I'm a power plant. I am no longer a passive consumer of this system that has existed forever, which is that my utility is in charge of power generation and distribution, and it just sells it to me. I am now potentially a very active participant in my electricity situation, and I have a thing of value that utilities need because they all know they can't meet the demand for energy that we're all creating just by our daily habits, but also by going more and more electric. I had a really interesting, I think you talked to him too. Dan Latano from Goodleap is the one who gave me this kind of great phrase. He said, I think there's a point where we're all going to know the price of a kilowatt hour the way we know the price of a gallon of gas, because this is going to be a thing that we have some control over, can generate, and can contribute as part of an economic ecosystem. And then all of a sudden, I think the energy conversations get really, really interesting. And in fact, you hear some of the fusion companies. I interviewed a company called Realtip Fusion that wants to co-locate fusion power plants with heavy industry infrastructure. So like if you're building a new data center, you also build a little fusion power plant next to that data center that powers it independently as a little island. I think that's when you start to unlock this. Always in technology, when you get rid of an existing paradigm and you disrupt the thinking about the way that energy should be produced and who should be in charge of getting paid for it, then all of a sudden stuff gets pretty cool.
I love that. I love that whole answer. It mirrors exactly where we are with our audience in the Supercool conversation. It feels like all roads certainly in energy transition lead to this conversation. Call it the virtual power plant, whether it's happening in the home or it's happening in industry or just batteries on the grid. But one of the things that struck me over the last few weeks, so it was probably post-election saying, okay, well, where are we? Same conversations I'm asking you. I was thinking about it and saw the stat that in 2024, global investment in clean energy was $2 trillion. That includes right? $2 trillion. And global investment in fossil fuel infrastructure was $1 trillion. So that's really incredible. And then you look at what percent of the global investment is U.S. investment in clean energy. Of course, it's huge, but it's not huge relative to that pie. You know, maybe it's like 350 billion out of 2 trillion or something. So even if that gets suppressed a little bit or like pulled back a little bit, like the train has left, right? This is happening in such a huge way. And like that investment, doubling fossil fuels, like fossil fuels investments haven't increased. They've either slightly declined or stayed pretty even for a decade. So that's kind of where I think maybe some hiccups. But to your point, like this is happening for reasons that I think just like you laid out, cost, climate change. The other thing, batteries. Oh my gosh, like the thing that like jumped out at us earlier this year was not just lithium ion batteries. Let's go put lithium ion on the grid and let's have a battery in our stove now with all these companies who are just putting batteries everywhere. But rethinking even what a battery is. We had on this company, Bren Miller, that's doing heat batteries for industry. Right? Where they're actually, and they're not alone. And I know Breakthrough Energy funded a company, I'll blank on the name, that's using heat batteries to help make like bullet bourbon in Kentucky, because they'll just like take the renewables, they'll store the energy as heat, and then that can be distributed back into the factory as either steam or heat or hot water, however you need it, and it replaces natural gas boilers. And so even the whole concept of what a battery is and fundamentally changes things, and happening like kind of while we were sleeping. Like in my mind, the only way I could think about it, Amazon's a bookstore. I love this Amazon bookstore. And then I went on there and I was like, what is this basketball doing here? Like, what the hell, Amazon? You're not allowed to sell basketballs. Like the thing just changes before you even know it's changed. What do you mean it's like in my everything, in my garage and in my stovetop, and then you love it, right?
And that it's my hot water heater or it's sand falling through a funnel, right? Or exactly. And when you layer on decentralization and you realize like, oh, we don't have to create one kind of battery that works everywhere. because the fact is there will be different thermal storage techniques that are applicable. I remember interviewing a guy who lived out in the desert as part of my How We Survive narrative series. Yeah, this group of people who live out on the Salton Sea, just like, let me talk about survivalism. But this guy was just like such a fundamental inventor. And he's like, yeah, I mean, if sand runs down here, then that turns this flywheel, and then this becomes a storage battery, and it just refills. And then the sun somehow expands this thing and refills it. And he was like, like all these people go to these spin cycle classes. He's like, the spinning wheels on those bikes could probably power the studio. They don't need electricity. I was just like, what?
Right.
It is changing your mindset about how everything's always been done.
Yeah.
So,
and you hear these companies, and we're going to talk to Sunrun soon. And so you hear like Sunrun and other companies saying that we were a solar company and we do still install solar, but we're a storage first company. Like that's their language, right? And it goes to what you're saying about this decentralization. So where do you see that today? I mean, there's the rise of virtual power plants, that there seems to be more coming. There is this idea of homes are becoming these little power centers unto themselves. Are there companies or specific technologies? Is there anyone that you see that you're like, these folks are just crushing it?
I do think that the companies like Sunrun and Enphase, the ones who are really doubling down on the idea of getting that storage deployed quickly, are doing a good job. And they are trying to work with utilities. Like this is where the other thing that happens in the technological march is where innovation meets industry. And, right now we have innovation crashing headlong into utilities who do not want to change their way of doing business, even though they know that they're in a little bit of a death spiral with respect to cost and energy production. So I think that the smart companies are engaging on the policy side, like your Good Leaps, and then the ones that are investing heavily in getting battery infrastructure installed know that they are moving in that direction. Like if you talk to the Enphase founders, they really understand that where they're headed is the ability to create a marketplace for homeowners and building owners to buy and sell power. But honestly, the only company that's really doing a good job in this space right now and really moving that conversation forward is like Nest. Because they have the deals with the utilities. You can opt into the power savings. You can say, yeah, control my thermostat for a couple of months to save me money. And then I get like a little $50 something. I don't even know what it's good for from Nest, but they're creating that consumer expectation that like maybe I get something out of changing my behavior. And that is something to watch.
So thinking about distributed energy and thinking about homes becoming their own mini power plants. You mentioned Nest, thermostats, we're talking about Enphase, we're talking about Sunrun, we're talking about companies that have really scaled, some of the larger players in this space. Do you see room for startups, for early stage companies? Are there gaps to be filled? I'm asking it as an investor, someone covering the space. Do you see companies emerging that are taking a different tack on things?
You never want to say that there's not room for startups because there's always an idea that you haven't thought of. I suspect where we are, and I don't want to be too prescriptive because as soon as I say something, there will be 5 companies that are like, I'm totally doing that. We're kind of we're looking for the enabling layer. So right now, a lot of the companies we talked about are in the hardware space. They have a device that they're deploying and then they're making these deals around those devices. And so they're in multiple versions of the business. I suspect the real game changer will come along that's like the company that actually figures out how to connect the energy distribution with the payback. Like I'm kind of making this up as we go, so stay with me. But I'm thinking, remember when Plaid, I mean, probably not because you didn't cover technology for 25 years, but I remember when Plaid was introduced. And if you're not familiar with Plaid, Plaid is the company that if you're like installing QuickBooks and you want to connect your bank account to QuickBooks, there's a little pop-up that lets you enter your bank information and then immediately connect that to QuickBooks. So that like did not exist until Plaid came along. They invented a company to be the authorization and transfer layer. between all of these services and your banking account. And that is like a game changer, because now you can build a million different things that will charge your bank account forever until you forget to turn it off. And when Plaid first came along, it was like explaining what they did. I was like, I don't understand a word of that. That makes like, and I don't even really know why you would need that. And
Right.
and now I'm like, oh, that enabled everything. I probably use that service 10 times a week, and all of us do, and we don't really think about it. I kind of think that in the energy infrastructure, for us to create this new marketplace for energy and get us to the part where we understand the pricing and whatever, that's what we need. Like Nest is doing a proto version of it, and GoodLeap is doing a proto version of it, but we need Plaid to come along and create that kind of seamless connection. Those are, I think, like when you get from baseline technology to mass adoption, it's those enabling technologies in the middle. That's why you heard so many VCs for so many years say, I'm looking for a marketplace business because I want to connect a business to a customer and get paid on both ends. And so from an investor perspective, awesome, I want that. But also we need those enabling layers to actually create the financial mechanisms to make it so.
Yeah, I'm going to have to think about
I'm
more.
such a nerd, Josh. I'm so sorry. I did.
Dude, I love it. I love the Plaid example. I'm sure Aaron, our producer, I'm sure he's sitting there loving it too.
Yeah, if you're building that, by the way, call us.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's a very helpful construct to think about, okay, well, what might be missing? Because for me, as a brand marketer, communicator, I really get the conversation that says there's not really a household name, a brand that if you said, hey, who's a big clean energy lifestyle brand, or who's a big solar brand in America? I mean, the closest is Nest right now, probably, because they probably sold more units into more homes than anybody else, but like there isn't one, right? And I know that these companies get it and are trying to position themselves. Like I think Sunrun, Mary Powell, I think she's really on it in terms of becoming a clean energy lifestyle brand. Palmetto, I know, is working on it. GoodLeap, obviously, but everyone's trying to be like, hey, we're the brand you can trust. We're the one who's going to take you to the promised land. And I think that's great, because I feel like finally people are saying, or companies are realizing, yeah, maybe we should just stop talking about the technology, because no one actually, in truth, like you and I are excited about batteries, but no one cares about batteries, right? They like having like peace of mind that if the lights go out and if extreme weather strikes, the power is going to stay on, right? So let's talk to them about peace of mind. Let's not talk about the battery, because no one, and I think that is coming. But you're talking about something that is maybe close in, but if I think about Plaid, because like I'm the same way when I think like this fintech stuff, I'm like, why is that valuable, right? Like, why is that thing going to be worth billions and billions and billions? Like, because my mind, I don't think that way. Yeah. And so I think I get what you're saying, that there's this layer still of like almost seamlessness that just enables like transactions to, to remove the friction, I guess. And is that
and
fair?
You're 100% right, though, that we also still don't have the iPhone. Like you could argue that for a while there, and maybe still, the household name that people are now starting to think of when they get a battery is they're thinking Tesla Powerwall. That's as close as we've gotten to that kind of iPhone experience where it's like, it's beautiful. They'll just come and do it. You won't even notice when the power goes out because your Powerwall will keep the lights on. And so we haven't totally nailed iPhone. And then I'm already asking I want 4G connectivity on my.
I think companies that have been in this space for a while, everyone sees the same future. Everyone's racing toward this future of like, oh my God, decentralization, homes as mini power plants. How do we make that go faster? And how do we make a lot of money from it? And how do we enable it? But let's switch gears for a minute. I want to talk about this other piece. Everybody in the pool, you've built your own platform, your own brand now, podcast, newsletter. You tell a lot of stories, surveying the landscape of, let's say, climate, call it media or branding or what have you, communication. What's good? What's missing? Are we learning things? Are we getting better at it? Are companies getting better at it? Are scientists getting better at it? Because you talk to so many different people.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
You have probably found this too. I'm sure you have. And I know you have, because you're doing a great job of this communication. Like the principles of storytelling are pretty universal, and yet so hard to get right. Like, one, people have to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you make money and how it will make their lives better. And so pretty universally, that applies to startup founders. That applies to anybody in any business. It applies to investors. And climate storytelling tends to get caught up in, I mean, the frustration I had with traditional journalism around climate storytelling was, one, no media outlet wants to do it. They think of it as like vegetables coverage. Like they're like, well, this is sort of the boring bummer stuff that no one's going to read. And you really cannot look at the climate story as, one, a traffic play, or two, a niche. Like every story is a climate story, and there is a way to put it in that lens every single time. I think that a lot of media outlets are still missing the fact that this is the biggest tech and business story in the world, that it's a business story. The best climate coverage I see, actually, even if it's by accident sometimes, is in the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and the Financial Times. The Economist and the Financial Times are doing it on purpose. The Wall Street Journal is sometimes writing about insurance, and they're definitely writing about climate change, and they're writing about housing prices, and they're writing about climate change. And so for me, I think there is still a big opportunity to put this in the language of money, because we know it works. And I don't mean to be mercenary about it, but that's capitalism has created most of these problems. It's also like the best incentive system that humans have ever created. So use it to define the risk, but also the opportunity. And I find that people really get excited about the idea that there are smart people working on genuine solutions that they just didn't know about. Half of it is just surfacing. There's like how you tell the story, but then there's just the part where like nobody knows. They literally don't know.
Branding experts will tell you you have to hear it like 7 times before you're like, oh.
Totally.
Now I
someone's
hear
working
it,
on that.
right?
Oh,
really?
someone's working on that. Oh, well,
Yeah,
that's weird.
right.
Yeah.
Here's the 7th time I'm telling you. So now I know that it's going to, and that's not a climate thing either. That's just the way we process information.
Yeah.
Years ago, when I had this TV show, The Lazy Environmentalist. So I'd go around greening, you name it, fashion designers, funeral homes, schools. It was really fun. It was like
So
kind of
cool.
this makeover, it was a
Yep.
makeover show. And it ended after 2 seasons. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay doing kind of TV and media at that time, because I really love startups. But we had this idea for a show. And so I got to pitch someone at CNN. This was 2011. Al Gore's movie had come out. Everybody had glommed on to the green thing. It had its like run. And then, of course, the financial recession. And now people have less space to think and less disposable income and less, interest in green for the moment. But I remember pitching this guy and I was like, look, this is not a green show. This is a show about hospitals where patients heal better and faster, right? This is not green. This is just about a school where performance is going up in like the inner city. And he's like, no one cares about green anymore, Josh. I'm like, dude, it's not a green show. It's just like, it just happens to be enabled by these things that also kind of cut carbon, like awesome daylighting or healthier materials. And he's like, nope, out. Like, we're just not.
Yeah.
No one's actually interested anymore. And what I actually thought was, I just don't think the producers and editors are interested anymore. But I think it comes back to the idea of how do you tell it in a way? How do you frame things up in a way that people are going to get interested and enthusiastic and be like, oh, tell me more, because that sounds like this is about my self-interest now. This is about the things I care about, profit or whatever it may be.
I think it's also possible, like that is 100% an appropriate CNN response to have. I will even say it is an appropriate New York Times response to have, maybe to say, certainly, let's say you're CNN, right? You measure your audience in the tens to hundreds of millions, and you're advertising supported. And so you need things to be popular. I would argue that if you're the New York Times or National Public Radio or a show on National Public Radio, you don't need things to be popular in the same way. However, the economics of journalism are such that people don't want to take a risk on something that isn't going to be popular because popularity pays. I would argue that there is that my show, I love my show. Every time I finish a script, I'm like, my God, this is so interesting, because I'm a giant nerd. This is never going to be popular content, like mass popularity. But I also think that the mistake we make is thinking that it has to be. Like, I don't need to convince everyone. I think of this as like an 80-20 situation, the classic kind of 80-20 problem. 20% of institutions and consumers and companies will make really big changes. And then hopefully in 10 or 20 or, sooner, but 10 or 20 years, the only thing on the shelf, the only thing in a lot is going to be an electric car, because it's so much cheaper to make, the end. And it's so much cheaper to drive. The only thing that you're going to find on the shelf is the sustainable alternative. 80% of people don't think about the fact that there isn't a lot of high fructose corn syrup on the shelves anymore. And it's because the right 20% found out that that'll kill you in any amount, and they got rid of it. So we just need to get movement at the 20%. And then we'll fix everything for the 80%, and you don't even have to say thank you. But like, that's not what my show is for. And mainstream media is never going to have the same incentive as us because they need it to be for 80%. It also might mean that we never make any money, but
well,
but that's not
TBD,
why I went into
TBD.
journalism.
I appreciate all of that perspective. It makes me feel a little bit better. I wish I had known you 15 years ago.
It's not you, man.
Gosh,
it's
dude,
not you. It's them.
Yeah, it's not you. Like, just move on. You're gonna be okay. As you think about everybody in the pool and where your coverage is going, what's out there that you're also excited to dig into now? You've looked at AI extensively. You went pretty deep with a whole bunch of companies. I thought that was really interesting. NVIDIA, where you talked to their head of sustainability, that was a really interesting conversation. So what else? Where are you taking your platform? What conversations do you want to have?
There's no question I'm going to be talking a lot about AI this year. AI, because it really is, I think, having a meaningful impact in the energy conversation, and hopefully in a positive way. But I don't want to bore everybody with AI all the time. Like I said, every time I do one of these episodes, I think some awesome thing comes out of it. Like I have an interview coming up pretty soon with a company that was former SpaceX engineers who literally were like, yep, we're going to go to Mars. And then they were like, this planet needs help. And so they're now using effectively the technology of rocket science to create base load energy from biomass. And then the output of the energy creation is basically water and a pure stream of CO2 that they can immediately sequester. So they're doing carbon capture by repurposing biomass that would otherwise just break down and emit. They're using it to create carbon negative energy because then they immediately sequester the CO2. And they're basically a bunch of rocket scientists who were like, this mission, no pun intended, is not as achievable as planet A, like our plan A, this planet. So one, you have cool technology, but two, the magic happens when someone just comes along and does something totally differently. So that's like an upcoming, it's Arbor Energy is the company. And I'm like so excited about that interview. I think that...
Can I just say one thing about that?
Yeah.
So with Planted, with our company, so I had started that with two guys from SpaceX to make carbon negative building materials. And it was the same conversation. And we all got to know each other as we were starting this thing 3.5 years ago. And so it was very similar. It's like, oh, well, we actually need to figure out Spaceship Earth. And these guys were responsible for at least keeping folks alive on the Dragon crew spacecraft for the life support system. So like we had to do that in a tiny little capsule. Now we got to do that and regulate like the carbon in this like Earth bubble. But the difference, I will say, between that and the guys who run Arbor, at least like Wada, my co-founder, well, Josh, he's like, the building materials we're making out of grass instead of trees, and we're storing carbon and blah, blah, blah. We're electrifying our factory. This is just phase 2 of the 7-phase plan where we do actually do this on Mars. And we're going to need like modular, small electric machines that can make building materials. And we'll put them on the ship, and they have to be small enough to get there because you can't have heavy things. So like phase 2, 7-phase plan, this is where we are.
That is hilarious. So just note to self, guys, the SpaceX guys all still secretly think we're going to Mars.
Yeah, it's just, you got to babysit the wait for fusion, the wait for some other things, and then, enabling technologies and off we go.
In that case, fine, we can have that conversation. But right now, let's just talk about this. Anyway, so I love that kind of thing. I love there's a company called Cocoon Carbon that just figured out that like a weird side effect of electrifying steel production is that previously, using horrible energy intensive blast furnaces, steel production produced this slag that was a key component in cement. But when they switched to electric arc furnaces, because the difference in the way it burns, the slag that comes out cannot be reused. So it's creating this it's like an unintended consequence of decarbonization, that this whole waste stream was being created that was literally toxic waste. And so along come some genius engineers who realize like, oh, okay, well, no, we definitely still want to keep decarbonizing steel. And here's an opportunity to then turn around and recreate the circularity that was lost. And so now they have figured out a process for turning this other kind of slag into cementitious material that's the same as Portland cement. Like that's the kind of stuff, again, nerd, that I get so excited about. It's like it's evolving with the times. And then also I love consumer stuff. Don't worry, everyone. I have like a coffee replacement company coming, and like there's the coffee conversations that are really interesting, because I don't know about your audience, and I'm assuming it's the same. My audience is ready to buy. They're like, cool, what can we do? You got a new kind of coffee for me? I'm in. I'm doing that. So
love it.
I think that sends a really important signal, especially now when you can't trust the policy environment.
Yeah, I love all those episodes. We'll have to have you back on because we'll probably have to dig into a little more policy stuff, but I'm glad we had the conversation we had today. This is awesome. And I didn't say it, just for our listeners, when I was talking with Molly, I guess probably a couple of weeks ago, I did close my eyes. Yep, that is the voice that I used to listen to all the time in the car, when I'd be like, kids, quiet, like I want to hear, So thank you for doing what you're doing, being on our show. Really, it's a pleasure to get to know you, and I'm excited to continue to follow everybody in the pool and all of your work. It's just awesome.
Thank you. I'm excited to have you on Everybody in the Pool.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.